Algumas doenças, e aqui eu destaco principalmente duas doenças infecciosas importantes, que são a leishmaniose e a febre maculosa, que tem em várias partes do mundo, nós não temos soluções possíveis, por falta de investimentos e de uma tecnologia adequada. Por exemplo, leishmaniose visceral, conhecida também como calazar, esteve fora do Estado de São Paulo durante quase 40 anos. E São Paulo, o Estado com maior número, com maior condição para resolver as situações, quando voltou a leishmaniose há 40 anos atrás, há pouco tempo atrás, há 20 anos atrás, nós não mais conseguimos eliminá-la. Não só não conseguimos, como ela está em expansão. E não é falta de recurso. Recursos existem para isso, mas nós não conseguimos entender o que está acontecendo. Conhecemos o vetor, sabemos a transmissão, tem os vetores intermediários, os cães, e nós não conseguimos fazer alguma coisa que não seja muito dolorosa para todos, como matar cães, que é uma coisa hoje que não se tem. Febre maculosa, a mesma coisa. Doenças absolutamente graves que têm acontecido em regiões aqui, que nós não temos tanto diagnóstico, como principalmente medicamentos adequados para eliminar. São doenças negligenciáveis, porque as pessoas não têm... você investir nessas doenças, ela não dá retorno financeiro. Então, eu entendo que um simpósio como este, ele é fundamental para que a gente possa albergar e pensar em alguns problemas de saúde em que não existem interesses comerciais exclusivos para resolvê-los, pessoas que vão ter lucros com esses investimentos. São investimentos... Então, o processo social aqui tem que prevalecer especificamente para resolver. Senão, nós não vamos ter solução, como nós não teremos soluções em vírus que aparecem na África a todo momento, como Ebola, Marburg e outros vírus. Bem, dito isso, então, eu já tenho a satisfação de ouvir já o primeiro tópico que nós vamos ter um debate posteriormente. Então, eu gostaria, então, de pedir para a doutora Verônica Arroyave que fale sobre o tema para nós, sobre, através dos investimentos possíveis e necessários. Por favor, Verônica.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much. This is a real pleasure to be here. It's a real honor to be with you today and to speak even a small excerpt of what the AbbVie Foundation is doing, and to share with you just a bit of information around what our initiatives are and where we plan to go forward in Latin America. So you're probably asking yourselves, what is the AbbVie Foundation? And rightly so. The AbbVie Foundation is a 2-year-old foundation with a 125-year legacy. It comes out of Abbott Laboratories, and the company split, and there was a formation of Abbott Laboratories and AbbVie Pharmaceuticals. And as a result, the Abbott Labs had a foundation that was Abbott Fund. And then as a result of the split, a new foundation was formed, which was AbbVie Foundation. Again, a 2-year foundation with a 125-year legacy. What came with it as a portfolio were the HIV/AIDS initiatives and the neglected tropical diseases initiatives. From that, we are adding hepatitis C and oncology to our philanthropic investment portfolio. And we've taken many of the neglected tropical disease programs that were Buruli ulcer in Côte d'Ivoire, and we're adding initiatives in Bolivia, in Chagas, in Colombia with soil-transmitted helminths, and in Mexico with soil-transmitted helminths, working in Chiapas region in Mexico. So from that, in terms of where we want to go, primarily the investments that the foundation had done had been in Africa and Asia. Going forward, what's exciting about the foundation, of which I've only been with for 5 months, so I speak to its history of since 2000, from my colleague here, Jeff Richardson, who's done most of that work. So in terms of the investments going forward, it'll be in Latin America. So that's what we're looking forward to in terms of those investments. And those will be in focal countries of Brazil, Argentina, Mexico, and Colombia, in those spaces of HCV oncology and neglected tropical diseases. So I wanted to, really sort of share with you and to sort of reflect on the themes that were shared this morning. I heard the themes of innovation, of sustainability, of solidarity, of public-private partnerships. And as I reflected on that, I think one of the things I wanted to share with you is an example, a unique example of innovation around looking at opportunities for cross-sectoral collaboration in philanthropy. I'll share with you an example of a group called the Partnership for Quality Medical Donations. It's pqmd.org. It's a membership organization of 16 pharmaceutical companies and 16 NGOs that meet regularly. It was founded in 1999, 32 members who meet regularly on an annual basis and have teleconferences to really share experiences, to share opportunities to improve the quality of medical donations to the developing world, to inspire innovation, ideas. And one of the things, I did a bit of research on this group, one of the things that I learned is that they really focus on emphasizing communication, collaboration, and coordination. And the ways in which they do that are really looking at bringing together what in normal life would be competitors, right? 16 of the largest pharmaceutical companies, 16 of the largest NGOs. And they've created a space or a platform. They've provided scaffolding and they've provided a space for convening where they've allowed pharmaceutical companies to look at opportunities and ways to come together to fund projects in collaboration. And these are major pharmaceutical companies, of which AbbVie is a part of, Abbott Labs is a part of, and several others. And so I really encourage you to maybe take a look at that model as one way to look at cross-sectoral collaboration and thematic topics that may be of interest. One of the things that they did recently that they've done really well since the tsunami is looking at how to come together for disaster relief initiatives, how to co-fund different projects in the developing world context. Additionally, in neglected tropical diseases, several companies are coming together to think through how might they leverage their expertise and their funding, and look at ways to inspire each other by providing and sharing best practices around corporate volunteering opportunities globally, domestically, what they might be doing in terms of response, disaster response, nationally and globally, and how they might start to formulate guidelines and ideas around where there are opportunities and gaps in what they're all doing, and really looking at best leveraging expertise, best leveraging opportunities. AbbVie is really happy and has been a part of this membership through its various iterations of Abbott and AbbVie for nearly 10 years. So it's really exciting to see where you have these different spaces where convenings, similar to what Aegis is doing. So, part of why we're here as the AbbVie Foundation is we're here to learn, we're here to understand, we're here to listen, and really look at where the opportunities are. Not to reinvent the wheel, because Brazil is a thriving economy. The region has wonderful examples of what it's doing, what in the social sector in particularly, wonderful examples of giving, philanthropy, and social enterprise. So we're here to learn, understand, and really look at becoming a part of this growing expansion, thriving economies, and looking at potentially growing alongside and helping support much of this growth, especially in the global health sector, again, in those areas of focal interest for our foundation. So we look to be a part of the dialogue. We look to be a part of potentially initiatives. We hope to work with other foundations, other donors, NGOs, universities, and different sort of means and foundations that would help us understand, grow, and get a better understanding of the landscape. So we welcome the opportunity to be here, and we hope to have a really thoughtful and important discussion.
Obrigado, Verônica. Agora, a doutora Helen Agler, que é CEO do The End Fund, vai falar para nós sobre inovações na saúde e através até de investimentos filantrópicos. Doutora Helen.
Hello, everyone. It's wonderful to be here. I started coming to Brazil back in 1997 with an organization called Operação Sorriso, which maybe some of you have heard of, does cleft lip and palate surgery. And it's been absolutely amazing to see, since now it's been almost 20 years, the shift in philanthropy and corporate engagement and volunteerism. So first, I just want to congratulate everyone who's been participating in this incredible revolution that's taking place here in Brazil. How many people before today had knowledge about what are neglected tropical diseases? I'm just curious okay, most people. I was sometimes asked who's had a neglected tropical disease, but I was warned recently, like, don't make people talk about their intestinal worm infections. But for those of you who don't know, the World Health Organization defines a group of diseases, 17 diseases, as neglected tropical diseases. And these include 10 of which pharmaceutical leaders like AbbVie and many others have stood up saying that they want to see controlled or eliminated by the year 2020. And this includes diseases that are endemic here in Brazil, like schistosomiasis, that kills 200,000 people per year, trachoma, that causes irreversible blindness and incredible pain, river blindness that's being eliminated here in Latin America, and just this year Colombia and Ecuador have certified elimination of those diseases, but there's still areas in northern Brazil that are fighting to see the end of river blindness. That's also painful, blinding, terrible disease that makes it impossible for people to live in arable land. As well as lymphatic filariasis, and some of you may know that more as elephantiasis, and I've had the chance to meet people living with advanced stage elephantiasis, and it's just huge tumors on their leg, makes it impossible to walk, very socially stigmatizing. And what you realize is even though these diseases are called neglected diseases, they're actually diseases of neglected people. I mean, these are diseases of poverty that if you don't have access to good water, sanitation, infrastructure, that you are often at risk of one of these diseases. So it's been a really interesting time in the neglected disease global community to see more funding, more interest, more research, more work on new diagnostics and tools, and more institutional funding. So there is, for 5 of the main diseases, that the primary strategy has been mass drug administration to everyone, kind of like a vaccination campaign, everyone at risk of these diseases. There's about 1.4 billion people globally who need medicines in order to ensure that they're not sick, and hundreds of millions of people who are actively infected with these diseases. And these 5 main pharmaceutical companies have stood up and said, we will donate as much medicine as is needed for as long as it's needed to see the end of these diseases. So it's just incredible opportunity. What's on the table from now until 2020 is about $18 billion of donated medicines that would save and improve a lot of lives. But the gap has been to ensure effective delivery of those medicines through this strategy of annual, sometimes biannual, mass campaigns through drug administration. And what we've seen is that over recent years, it's grown significantly. I mean, just a few years ago to now, it's increased by several hundred million people globally getting these medicines that they need. But it's still only about half of the people that need it, and not everyone's being treated for the whole series of diseases. So the End Fund story is really one about how private philanthropy has come to engage in this cause of seeing the end of these diseases. And a group of private philanthropists, sort of someone who has a family foundation from New York, someone who has a private philanthropic foundation from Dubai, several other families came together and said, the level of resources that we have isn't enough to make the big difference that we need to. One of the foundations had actually piloted a project in Rwanda and Burundi, very small countries, over a period of 5 years to do mass drug administration with some water and sanitation efforts, and saw this dramatic reduction in disease. Said, okay, we've reduced schistosomiasis by 90%. It used to be 1 out of every 3 kids had very severe intestinal worm infections, and now it's less than 1 in 10. But they realized in order to take care of this problem globally and meet the funding gap, they would need more partners. So they created the End Fund, which is a private philanthropic investment fund that's a platform for donors to collaborate, co-fund neglected disease projects, There's a technical advisory group that's part of the End Fund that are leading scientists all over the globe in this field of neglected diseases. There's a programmatic team inside the End Fund that sort of scopes out where are the gaps globally. Currently, the End Fund has identified programs in 15 countries where it's investing. And what's interesting is because it was created as a platform to support an entire movement, the focus has been on the donors and on really making this interesting, accessible. These are unpronounceable diseases, often that many people have not heard of. And so to really make it of interest, so creating opportunities to go to the field, to meet patients, to see where their private dollars could make an outsized impact. And so some of the projects that were chosen were things like in Mali, the US government was funding a neglected disease program, but after the coup there, the US funding could not be mobilized. So the private philanthropists came in and filled that gap and made sure that 13 million people got the medicines that they needed. There's an effort going on in Tanzania now where they found a backlog of thousands of people who need trachoma surgery. Otherwise, they will go blind. And now are implementing a program to make sure 5,000 of those people get surgery. So just very tangible ways of getting into a huge problem. And so far, the End Fund group of investors has mobilized close to $50 million it'll be by the end of this year. So that's really in less than 3 years is a huge amount of funds to be mobilized. And this year will ensure medicines are delivered to over 50 million people in 15 countries. And what I love about it is just it's such a personal story of families. I mean, like you see husbands, wives with their kids deciding to start a family foundation, and this is where they've made their first investment, and they travel together to Africa for the first time and see this transformational change. And I think that for all of us working in philanthropy, we realize there are so many social problems and so many needs, and you focus on people suffering from just painful diseases. But I also feel like the stakeholders that we need to think about are all of us in this room and engaging other donors and philanthropists. And actually, philanthropy means love of humanity. And it's an act of giving and the act of giving it the highest part of yourself. That's kind of a form of self-realization. And so we really at the End Fund have had this value of like, how can we make this the best experience possible for the group of investors so that you can create this growing group of people that will be committed to diseases of poverty and people living with these diseases around the world. So I think it's just been a very interesting platform to create a very narrow, specific set of diseases and engage donors around those. And all of the grants that are made as a consortium, and we sort of ensure that all the reporting back to donors, they've agreed on a common platform for reporting, and that's, for those of you in the grant world know that that's sometimes very difficult. So that's just something that we've been trying to experiment with. Can we create efficiencies through integration, through collaboration? And it's so far been just a wonderful experience, and I'd be glad to kind of share further information, or if you want to visit end.org. We're constantly showing new information about these donor collaboratives. So thank you.
Muito obrigado, Agler. Agora vamos já pedir imediatamente para o Dr. Wilson Pollara, que é secretário adjunto da Saúde de São Paulo e com uma experiência grande hospitalar, tendo trabalhado no Hospital das Clínicas, coordenando uma área por muito tempo também.
Então, eu queria inicialmente agradecer o convite para poder estar falando para uma plateia tão qualificada como essa. E eu ingressei junto com o Dr. Marcos Kiesel na Faculdade de Medicina em 1968. Acredito que alguns de vocês nem nascidos estavam, né? E durante praticamente 20 anos eu permaneci dentro da universidade. Fiz todos os meus graus, mestrado, doutorado, livre docência, e há uns 25 anos atrás eu tive a oportunidade de começar a participar em uma rede de hospitais filantrópicos. E eu cheguei a participar da administração de uma rede de 33 hospitais do Brasil. Então, eu tinha conceitos da medicina, de cirurgião como cirurgião prático, e de hospital e de filantropia. Fui também diretor do hospital universitário, na época que o professor Marcos Boulos era o diretor da faculdade, e há 1 ano e 2 meses atrás eu fui convidado para ser o secretário adjunto da Saúde do Estado. Em lá chegando, eu encontrei uma rede de 611 hospitais para serem administrados, dos quais 400 eram filantrópicos ou santas casas, completamente quebrados, destruídos, dos quais 200 eram pequenos hospitais com menos de 50 leitos. Então, nós tentamos fazer, inicialmente era um plano que tinha uma ideia financeira, mas depois passou a ser um plano que os senhores vão entender, de formação de redes hospitalares, já que esses hospitais não conseguem viver sozinhos. E, recentemente, nós, através do nossa amizade e nosso conhecimento, nós estamos em contato fizemos um convênio com o Instituto IDES para ensinar esses hospitais filantrópicos a obter doações, porque eles perderam essa capacidade. Quando nós nos formamos, eu e o Marcos, nós tínhamos 3 tipos de pacientes. O primeiro era um particular, que conseguia pagar ainda o atendimento médico, que naquela época não era tão caro como é hoje. O segundo é aqueles do Instituto Nacional de Previdência Social, o INAMPS, que precisava da carteira de trabalho para ser atendido. E o terceiro grupo eram os indigentes, ou FUN rural, que nós chamamos, que não tinham direito a nada. Então, as irmandades, as entidades beneficentes, os filântropos, os doadores, faziam a sua beneficência doando às santas casas. Esse era o esquema. A maçonaria, o Rotary, o Lions, as igrejas, doavam às santas casas. Em 1988, o governo falou: saúde é direito do cidadão e dever do Estado. Pode deixar que eu vou pagar a conta. E saíram, as entidades filantrópicas saíram totalmente das doações. E realmente o que o governo pagou não foi suficiente. Por quê? Porque ele colocou mais 1/3 pagava e ele colocou mais os outros 2/3 que não pagavam dentro do sistema sem aportar mais nenhum recurso. Foi o que quebrou o sistema de saúde. Então, esse programa que nós vamos mostrar é um programa que tende justamente a recuperar e dar condições a essas santas casas de se recuperarem financeiramente, recuperar o seu prestígio dentro da comunidade e recuperar a sua capacidade de obtenção de doações. Inicialmente, nós fizemos uma classificação dos melhores hospitais, aqueles que poderiam ser o centro das redes, dessas redes hospitalares. E nós chamamos esses hospitais de hospitais estruturantes. Então, através da classificação da sua resolutividade, complexidade, porte e abrangência para outros municípios, eles foram classificados em estruturantes. E nós encontramos 38 hospitais que poderiam ser realmente hospitais com essas características. Destes, 9 já eram filantrópicos. E dos que foram classificados como hospitais de ensino, 17 deles, 50% também eram filantrópicos. Então, 50% do total desses hospitais eram filantrópicos. E 56% dos atendimentos do SUS também eram realizados por hospitais filantrópicos que estavam numa situação muito precária, por isso que eu falei para os senhores. Então, qual foi o princípio? O princípio foi tratar de forma simples o simples e tratar de forma complexo o complexo. Naqueles hospitais de alta complexidade, só iriam os pacientes que necessitassem daquela alta complexidade. E nós utilizaríamos aqueles outros hospitais que hoje estavam abandonados e que não tinham condições de obter essa complexidade para tratar os casos mais simples, mas tutoriados pelo hospital de alta complexidade. Então, o hospital estruturante de casos terciários, ele precisava se aliviar de dois tipos de pacientes. Os pacientes crônicos, e nós classificamos esses hospitais como hospitais de apoio. Ao final, eu vou mostrar um videozinho para os senhores entenderem que tipo de hospital é esse. São hospitais muito simples, mas que prestam um serviço maravilhoso. E hospitais estratégicos, que são aqueles que fazem os procedimentos de baixa complexidade, as pequenas cirurgias, as hérnias, as varizes, as internações de curta permanência. Desta forma, nós formamos uma rede, tendo como central o hospital terciário, e a este hospital se referem todas as outras estruturas de saúde da região. E nós temos um novo fluxo, que é o paciente, uma vez ele deixou de necessitar dos recursos do hospital estruturante, ele volta para o hospital de apoio ou volta para o hospital estratégico, criando um novo fluxo de retorno do paciente e preservando os leitos de alta complexidade para pacientes que realmente precisam daquela estrutura. Para que isso seja viável, eles têm que ter uma gestão compartilhada, eles têm que trabalhar em conjunto e eles têm que ter o mesmo sistema de informação. Nós temos 17 regiões de saúde no Estado, então foram criados inicialmente um hospital para cada uma das regiões, e no município, na região 1, que é a região do Grande São Paulo, por conter metade da população do Estado, nós dividimos essa região em mais 11 sub-regiões. Então, nós temos atualmente 36 regiões. Então, aqui 34 redes. Então, aqui os senhores veem o município centro da rede, o número de municípios que ele atende, a população e o número de redes que eles contêm. Então, hoje nós temos 645 municípios, 41 milhões de habitantes, 34 redes hospitalares. Nós temos 21 estruturantes, 39 estratégicos, 69 apoio. Atualmente, são 129 hospitais já participando desta rede. E aqui a distribuição, os senhores veem que eles estão homogeneamente distribuídos pelo Estado. A resolução ela é de fevereiro de 2014, e ela prevê auxílio financeiro às instituições filantrópicas, chamado Santa Casa Sustentável. Para que eles tenham essa adesão, todos os seus leitos têm que estar numa central de regulação, chamada CROSS. Essa central de regulação, ela que diz para onde o paciente tem que ir, através da regulação pré-hospitalar, de urgência, dos leitos e do ambulatório. Então, para que o hospital participe, ele tem que implantar protocolos de classificação de risco na entrada para que o paciente possa ser classificado pela gravidade, atender a urgências 24 horas, atender os demais municípios da região, não se sentir invadido por populações de municípios vizinhos, implantar protocolos de alta hospitalar qualificada, isso é, o paciente não precisa mais desse hospital, pode ser transferido para outro, iniciar processo de implantação de custos, porque nós controlamos todos os indicadores desses hospitais, e cumprir as metas de humanização do Estado. Existem 3 comissões, uma comissão estadual, uma comissão regional e uma comissão técnico-executiva que revê o programa continuamente. Existe um forte apoio financeiro e o Estado dá 70% a mais do que o SUS paga para o hospital estruturante, 40% para o hospital estratégico, acima do que o SUS paga, e para o hospital de apoio 10%, mas nós pagamos R$ 300 por dia por leito através dessa RUI. Nesse ano foram 535 milhões investidos nesse programa. Através do Instituto IDES, nós também estamos criando um ambiente favorável de investimento social. O Instituto IDES está indo nas Santas Casas para ensiná-las a como tem que obter os recursos, cria planos de obtenção de recursos, oferece soluções para doadores e tem um forte apoio ao terceiro setor. E o fundraising é exercido por tutores experientes em captação de recursos. Cada tutor dedica 30 horas mês por Santa Casa, e o papel do tutor é apoiar o desenvolvimento das tarefas, articular e integrar as Santas Casas entre elas, compartilhar o conhecimento já existente e estimular as ações que a Santa Casa já está realizando. Os objetivos é o fortalecimento da capacidade de captação de recursos privados de cada uma das Santas Casas, medir por indicadores objetivos a real capacidade de obtenção de recursos do terceiro setor e criação de um departamento de captação de recursos para cada uma das Santas Casas. Esse programa também cria indicadores de controle hospitalar, para saber como é que a Santa Casa está indo, e nós temos 12 indicadores online, são indicadores que eu, apertando um botão, eu sei no meio do mês como esse hospital está indo. Eu não preciso esperar o final do mês para ver um relatório. Então, são 4 indicadores de saída, que a gente diz, porque são indicadores influenciados por outros indicadores, e o que vai dar uma transparência e uma confiabilidade que aquela doação que nós estamos fazendo para a Santa Casa está sendo utilizada adequadamente. Isso é uma segurança para o doador. Então, nós temos indicadores de produção, indicadores financeiros e indicadores de qualidade de atendimento. Aqui, senhores, já veem, nós temos, além desses indicadores, quando eles são clicados, outros 32 indicadores aparecem. Então, aqui, senhores, já veem os primeiros resultados. Aqui o controle de 17 hospitais, do tempo de permanência, e aqui a taxa de ocupação dos hospitais, eles são seguidos em comparação um com o outro. Aqui nós temos o que eles gastam, por exemplo, com recursos humanos e o que eles gastam com recursos de terceiros. E aqui nós já temos alguns resultados. O senhor já vem, por exemplo, a Santa Casa de Franca, ela já era um estruturante. O senhor já veem, olha, ela atendia 1.200 casos e mandava para outros hospitais somente 30, 35. Olha esse Hospital Santo Amaro, ele não era estruturante, mandava muita coisa para fora, e olha, depois dele ser estruturante, deixou de mandar e assume todos os casos. A Santa Casa de São José dos Campos aumentou 10 vezes a sua capacidade de atendimento, assume todos os casos terciários, não pede vaga para ninguém. E aqui a média complexidade, os senhores veem como está caindo nos hospitais estruturantes, mostrando que eles estão se concentrando naqueles casos mais graves. Então, em que ponto nós estamos? O programa teve início em janeiro de 2014, já contratualizamos todos os estruturantes do interior, contratualizamos parcialmente os estratégicos, o início da avaliação dos indicadores é terceiro trimestre de 2014, e a aplicação das regras, porque existem regras tanto de premiação quanto de punição, se os indicadores não estão indo de acordo. Então, em conclusão, utiliza-se a melhor capacidade instalada, os fluxos, damos fluxos e lógica ao sistema, aos pacientes, dá uma maior eficiência e economia e, principalmente, dá satisfação ao cliente.
Terminamos as apresentações, agradecemos já de antemão todas as apresentações, e nós temos algumas questões aqui, e as questões podem ser feitas também no microfone aqui na frente. A primeira é uma pergunta da Emanuele, do Santander, para o Dr. Wilson. Como estamos nos preparando para atender da forma adequada nossa população de idosos em franco crescimento? E como as empresas devem e podem se envolver?
O desafio é muito maior. Na realidade, o que a gente está fazendo é exatamente... Nós temos que fazer o mesmo olhar que se tinha antes com a pediatria, toda aquela puericultura, nós temos que ter com o idoso. O idoso ele tem a capacidade você tem que primeiro classificá-lo segundo os riscos. Todo idoso tem, pelo menos, nós temos 8 perguntas que a gente faz, que são 8 riscos iminentes. Quer dizer, a diabetes, a obesidade, o colesterol elevado, e alguns riscos específicos, tipo risco de queda em casa. Então, a primeira coisa é a prevenção, profilaxia, como se fosse um pediatra. Então, o geriatra hoje é quase o que um pediatra. Em segundo lugar, nós temos que entender que nós temos um outro extremo também. Nós temos o extremo do idoso quando ele chega no final da vida. Tem um estudo feito no PROASA, que é um curso de pós-graduação, que mostra o seguinte, que nós gastamos 70% do que nós gastamos de saúde na nossa vida no último ano de vida. E 50% que nós gastamos de saúde na nossa vida inteira é nos últimos 3 meses. Quer dizer, metade do que nós estamos gastando para morrer. Então, nós temos que ter esse entendimento. Então, nós temos que agir nas duas pontas. E dar qualidade de vida, que isso é a própria sociedade que está se preparando para isso.
Bem, next question to Ellen and Verónica. What do you think of the anti-vaccination movement? Is there any scientific basis for this? What are the risks for public health if movement grows?
Well, the company AbbVie Pharmaceutical is not a vaccine company. However, I would say in terms of the AbbVie Foundation, which we really focus on philanthropic investments, our interest is really looking at building health infrastructure, building health systems, building support systems, building community health training programs, and looking at focusing on the measures and ways in which a community can be supported, provided tools, training, and opportunities to support the NGO structures that are within those communities, hospitals, health clinics, laboratories. There's several examples in terms of what the AbbVie Foundation has done, and that comes from its history. Over 7 million children and families have been helped. 100,000 healthcare workers have been trained. Over $300 million have been invested in Asia and Africa in terms of HIV/AIDS. And so it really does, in terms of what we do as a foundation, it really is looking at investing in health infrastructure and supporting the ways in which we can support global health efforts in neglected tropical diseases and in other viral infections that may be affecting our populations. As well?
I missed the question. Can you read it again? Okay, so the question is about the anti-vaccination movement. It's interesting. I'm personally very, very worried about this. I think that the scientific data has been, I'm not a vaccine specialist, but I think it's been hugely blown out of proportion. And it's a little bit the power of the internet and social media and activists and scientists not actually being good public communicators. I think that there's a real need to have a conversation between scientists and the public that often isn't happening. It's certainly not happening in the United States. And I recently had lunch with the former Secretary of Health of Nigeria. And I was asking him about the problems in northern Nigeria around the polio vaccination. That was, now 4 or 5 years ago. And there was a huge resurgence in polio cases in northern Nigeria because there was a distrust from the local population that these vaccines were going to cause sterilization, kill them. And it was partly the religious leaders, the imams, who were sharing this message. And so, of course, most of the people in the United States said, these religious activists, how could they do this? And the Minister of Health said, actually, people thought that they were uneducated in the north of Nigeria, but they're actually very educated. They're reading a lot. They're tuned into the media. And he went and personally sat down with the imams. And the imams brought out their iPads and started flipping through articles and showing online all this anti-vaccination movement literature that was being generated out of the United States. And he said, no, this is what we're reading, and this is why we're deciding not to vaccinate our population. So it just sort of turned on the head where this information comes from. And it's also an incredibly, in the US at least, a very educated population. So it's, to me, as a public health professional, just completely confusing. And I worry about my child living in the US that's now seeing more measles cases than ever, seeing a resurgence of diseases we just haven't had to worry about. And I think partly we're a generation that doesn't remember when these diseases were such a big problem. So I can't speak to I think there are growing risks, but I think it's something that we all kind of need to encourage public conversation about and more of a scientific discussion.
Let's keep a few offers. The next question is to you, Ellen, from Paulo, from Operação Sorriso. The biggest challenge in Brazil is establish a long-term private-public partnership. Politicians are usually concerned on short-term impact. How you manage this issue in Africa? Or you work only based on private support?
Thank you for the question, Paulo. One of the issues with neglected tropical disease control is the scale of the intervention is so large that needs to happen that it's impossible not to work with the government. So it doesn't lend itself, unless you're doing research projects, but implementation, unless it's you pick an NGO and work in a very small community and sort of do a best practices where the NGO can own the project. But in cases where you need to be distributing to sometimes tens of millions of people, you have to mobilize the entire network of community health workers in a country. So it's a huge challenge. It's a huge challenge. But because for neglected tropical diseases, there's been World Health Assembly resolutions that this is a priority. It's incorporated into national plans. The private sector can kind of help provide technical assistance, provide additional support. Sometimes we've seen sort of NGOs literally fund positions inside of the government, sort of seconding to the government to help build capacity and do training over time. But it's got to be like side by side. And it's essentially, it comes down to, in many cases, individuals and leadership. And people might have an idea. I've had this problem because I work in the Democratic Republic of Congo, that people say, oh, how could you work in the Congo? It's so corrupt. Well, you can't say something about an entire country. It's really can be focal depending on the project and the individual. And we've had amazing luck in some countries and huge problems in others. And sometimes the problems are not necessarily the government, but that there's no health systems. We have a large project in Ebola, for example. I mean, in Liberia, and because of the Ebola outbreak, it's just the health system is crushed and not able to handle many other health challenges. So it's just come to a standstill. But interesting question. Thank you.
Any more question? Oh, I asked for both of you. What need for the public government is still have to be prioritized from the philanthropy? Philanthropy to prioritize the government. What the government need to do to receive the philanthropy?
I can't speak for the Brazilian government, but I can say that in terms of the philanthropy as a space and as an opportunity for investment, I think that there are several opportunities for forums like this to continue, for dialogue to be encouraged, for coalitions to be built around supporting governments, supporting NGOs, and supporting different forums that really look at building partnerships around gaps that exist, not only in terms of government availability, its reach, its ability to reach different populations and different disease states that require so many resources. I think part of the investment strategy of any government is to figure out what resources it has outside of its budget, what resources it has in the private sector, different foundations, and the donor community to come together to work towards a common goal. I mean, I think that at the end of the day, it can't be done alone, and I think the real mobilization and opportunity is how to mobilize and leverage resources and expertise.
I think private philanthropy can be considered risk capital for innovation in ways that the government can't move money. So I've seen so often that philanthropy drives innovation and may create a model or a best practice or a pilot project that if it's demonstrated to work well and work better than what the government is doing, then the government may adopt that. I mean, you've seen that a lot in the United States with philanthropy. I think even the example of Operation Smile here in Brazil, when Operation Smile first came to Brazil, there was a huge resistance to doing any kind of volunteer surgeries, and there was a law that any child born in Brazil had to be flown to Sao Paulo at a specialty center to get surgery. And it really wasn't until Operation Smile that a huge campaign and thousands of children showed up that had never received surgery, and they were very late in their childhood or even into their adulthood, that it kind of helped wake up and change the conversation with the government that, okay, actually this system we have in place is not working, and there maybe that needs to change. And I think when it comes to neglected diseases, I mean, I pulled the numbers today. It's 12 million children less than 15 years old here in Brazil are at risk of infection. 1.5 million people require treatment for schistosomiasis. 1.7 million people are at risk of lymphatic filariasis. 14 million people live in areas with river blindness. 50 million people are at risk of trachoma. These numbers are huge, and I know that there are strong government programs, and there's been so much more progress than is taking place in a lot of places that we work in Africa. But I would think that's a very good opportunity for the government that's working more in this area than the private sector is, to carve out and say, this is where we could use private philanthropic support. This is a particular area of need, and I think sometimes in public health it's sort of seen as the government's issue, and actually there's a huge space and interest for private philanthropy to be involved, especially in something so tangible, so life-saving, with such a clear end. And as you've seen, this is what's mobilized people like Bill Gates, who now are passionate in putting so much money into eradicating polio. Just this last weekend, he announced he wants to see malaria eradicated in his lifetime, and is putting another $500 million this year toward that. These are big statements, and a sense that personal philanthropy also wants to see something in their lifetime that can be dramatically improved. And so to say you could check off these diseases, by the time we all in this room die, these diseases could be history. It's a very compelling thing for private philanthropists that I think in large part is not right now private philanthropy part of the conversation. So I think that there's just some space to think more from both sides about how a public-private partnership could be actualized.
Yeah. Well, the last question for you too, Agler. The end fund only works with existing treatments, or it also invests in research and development for improving or developing new treatments?
The end fund founding was really around the idea of delivering treatments, that for many diseases there still isn't a solution. I mean, you talked about that in your opening remarks, that there's not enough research and development, but for some diseases, the medicines are available, the treatment is clear, the tool is ready, and it just needs to be scaled up. And so that was the vision of what the End Fund could do. Now, there's other great organizations like DNDI, the Drugs for Neglected Diseases Initiative. There's, I know the Gates Foundation brings together are you DNDI? Oh, good. Okay. Well, DNDI, we should talk to her. So, and in some ways, the End Fund, we incorporate operational research into field programs, but that's a whole sort of separate group of organizations and funders that look on the R&D side that I'm sure you could speak to.
Em português. A pergunta é para todos os membros, e agora é a última porque nós não teremos mais tempo mesmo. Num sistema de saúde de custo crescente, numa sociedade onde ainda convive doenças negligenciadas, com crescente presença de doenças crônico-degenerativas, como conciliar uma participação eficiente, eficaz e efetiva do setor público e privado? Quer começar?
No Brasil, é um pouco difícil, pela legislação, haver uma doação direta do privado para o governo. Nós não temos esse mecanismo. O que nós podemos fazer é o seguinte: o governo tem que dar vantagens para o doador e tem que dar condições para o privado atender a população. Então, é isso exatamente que nós estamos fazendo. Nós estamos resgatando os filantrópicos que têm condições de receber as doações. Resgatando esses filantrópicos, o governo tem condições legais de contratá-los, então ele pode usar o dinheiro de doação para atendimento da população, e o governo pode se manter em ações como essa das chamadas doenças negligenciadas. Quer dizer, eu acho que é muito difícil você encontrar uma doação para uma campanha de vacinação. Por exemplo, o povo brasileiro, o costume brasileiro é achar que isso é responsabilidade do governo. E também outra coisa muito importante que eu acho que o governo tem que fazer, que nós estamos tentando fazer através dessa transparência de números, é resgatar a confiança do doador, porque justamente o grande problema, houve a perda da doação por perda de confiança de que aquele dinheiro realmente vai ser utilizado adequadamente. Então, nós estamos agindo nas duas pontas. Nós estamos tentando unir o doador com o receptor, e nós estamos gerando mais confiança ao doador, porque aquele dinheiro investido realmente vai ter uma destinação adequada.
You know, one of the things that I've learned in working in this space, particularly among philanthropists, governments, et cetera, is that everyone wants more coordination, but no one wants to be coordinated. And so one of the things that's really important is looking at coalitions, different spaces that need to be carved out. There are so many challenges, and the opportunities are immense. I think it really does depend on where there is interest, energy, overlapping, funding, and where different coalitions can be built around the topics that are important to governments, to people, to populations, to the world. I mean, these are all our diseases. And so at the end of the day, coordination, as aspirational as it is what we'll need in order to move forward, to think, to provide leadership, and to provide funding around where overlapping interests lie.
I will second your comments on coordination and creating networks. I think that sometimes sitting on the government side, civil society looks very disorganized and messy, and it's like 1,000 flowers blooming, and how do you coordinate? And even within one specific disease area, there might be a lot of different groups. And I think actually Marcus Casil the other night said, really, before we can activate private philanthropy to do specific neglected tropical disease programs here in Brazil, we need to create a network. We need to create some sort of structure to bring the different disease groups together, start to speak with a common voice, and be able to have an advocacy leverage as well as a coordination leverage so that we can be more effective. And I think actually it's a really interesting idea, and it's something that's changing a lot in even philanthropy globally, that people are looking at cause-based networks rather than sort of growing your own institution and the way that you do philanthropy, but really organizing around that. And I think it's shown to be quite successful, maybe something to consider here in Brazil.
Bem, eu acredito que nós tivemos uma fim de manhã bastante proveitoso com relação ao que se pretendia fazer aqui. Discutir essa interação entre a filantropia, investimentos, em buscar uma ciência, tecnologia para resolver vários problemas que nós temos, principalmente com doenças negligenciadas. Queria agradecer muito Verônica, Ellen, Wilson pela participação e a presença de todos vocês. Está encerrada a sessão.